Hello there and welcome to another video. From the title of the video you have most likely already know what kind of video this is going to be. It's going to be a tier list video with me ranking the 250 most highly ranked SCPs on the SCP wiki. Well, not exactly 250 because there are about 23 SCP articles that I haven't read yet. So, the tiers are S, the best, to A, B, C, D, E, and F, F being subsequently the worst tier. Of course, this is all my opinion and shouldn't be taken as an objective opinion. So, the first SCP that we are going to rank is SCP-001 Dr. Bright's Proposal, The Factory. Now, this one is a very interesting SCP-001 proposal because, unlike the other or most of the other SCP-001s or most other SCP articles, it's actually a tale and not your classic SCP format with special containment procedures and object class and description, which definitely sets this SCP apart from most other SCPs. Combine that with the very interesting story and concept of the factory and the things and concepts that it created for the SCP community, like the Fae and the origins of the O5 Council and so much more. SCP-4000 being one of the SCPs that were spawned after the creation of SCP-001, the factory. Definitely gives this SCP an A tier. Why I'm not putting this in S tier? I don't know. I don't feel like it deserves A tier. I am giving A tier, S tier to SCPs that are really outstanding and very, very creative and well written. Next, SCP-001, another proposal, the Gate Guardian. This is going to go to a B tier. Now, I do really like the concept of the Gate Guardian, it being the Archangel Uriel and the Garden of Eden and all of that religion Bible stuff. That's pretty cool, but the thing that detracts from its coolness is that in the actual file there are many data expunges and redactions, censoring, which is very, very odd because SCP-001 is a file that only the O5 Council can access, and for the file having data expunged and censored stuff, it's very, very confusing and doesn't really make that much sense, but it's a B tier. It deserves B tier. And the most popular and most well-known SCP-001 proposal indeed. The next we have DJ Cactus Proposal, the first part of the Ouroboros Cycle 001 proposal. It's been a long time since I've read this article, but from what I can still remember, it deserves a C tier. It's another world-ending, very destructive weapon, but built and utilized by the SCP Foundation. And then an O5 Council member deserts from the Foundation and subsequently founds the Chaos Insurgency, which is definitely pretty neat. The children themselves deserve the C tier. Next, SCP-001 Jonathan Bolt's Proposal, the Sheaf of Papers. Now, I do really enjoy the concept of the Sheaf of Papers. I really do. Every time you flip the papers, another SCP is being discovered, with the page detailing the description of the SCP. But the thing is that really puts this into F tier is that it doesn't really make sense because first it detailed SCP-002, then SCP-003, and so on and so forth. But many of these SCPs were, for example, SCP-049 was later discovered than, I don't know, SCP-048. Or earlier discovered, which it doesn't really make sense from a timeline perspective. And who would flip those papers about 6,000 times? Because SCP-001 Jonathan Bolt's proposal was written when there were only about 1,000 or below SCPs, and at the time it worked, and it was a pretty nice concept at the time, but now with over 6,000 SCPs with varying different origins, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore. It's an F tier. Then Kate McTeary's proposal, a record. Many 001s at the beginning. From what I can remember, it's a researcher, Dr. Mary Nakayama, achieving godhood, essentially, by discovering the SCP-001 slot's true nature. Everything written into it will subsequently become true, and she discovered it when she was filing data on an SCP which put itself always onto the number 1 slot, or in general put itself onto number 1. And Mary Nakayama just happened to discover the true nature of 001 slot. It's definitely an interesting story, but it's ultimately left open. Dr. Mary Nakayama writes herself into godhood and stuff. Isn't hostile, of course. It's classified as a formal class SCP because she's actually helpful, of course, because she was a former member of the SCP Foundation. But the story is left very open, and it doesn't really explain why the 001 slot actually has these properties. But it's a very well-written article, so it deserves B tier. Then, SCP-001-36. Now, this has a lot to do with religion and so much other stuff. It deserves C tier. It deserves B tier. It's very cool. I have nothing bad to say about this one. It's a very nice and very well executed concept, tying into religion and so many other religion-based SCPs like 076 and 073. A B tier. The World's Gone Beautiful, Lily's proposal. It's an interesting 001 proposal, a very interesting one. It doesn't really cover the origins of the SCP Foundation, the origins of the anomalies, or the end of the world. It kind of explains the end of the world, but not really how everything will end. But one of the more wholesome SCPs, and it's definitely a nice change from the many 001 proposals, which are kind of over the top and omniversal threats. Definitely a nice change. C tier. When Day Breaks. Most definitely A tier. The amount of stories that are on YouTube related to When Day Breaks and the creativity behind it and what the stuff you can do with When Day Breaks is just astounding. Just simply very, very astounding. And it's a very well-written article by itself. Very nice anomaly. A very, very sad story. The end of the world and what you're supposed to do when day breaks happens. You can just go off yourself, to be honest. When this would happen, there's literally no hope left. No hope. The next is Dr. Mackenzie's proposal, The Legacy. Now, that's an interesting one. Just like McTeary's proposal, a record is this story is left very, very open, and it definitely gets minus points for that. I want a whole story from a 001 proposal, not just a half-baked story. But for what is at hand, it deserves a C tier. It's just another world-ending SCP, but it kind of explains where all the SCPs come from. All those SCPs come from different universes and are bleeding into one universe, which is definitely a very interesting, at the same time dull concept, but it was executed fairly well. A C tier. Dr. Mann's proposal, The Spiral Path. The anomaly itself, the Spiral Path, could be a little bit more expanded upon. The only thing I really like about the Spiral Path is the O5 node, which explains how the O5 Council and the early beginnings of the SCP Foundation created every single SCP and kind of opened a tear in space-time, a glitch in reality, and then SCPs just spawned out of nowhere without them really being able to control it. Definitely a very interesting concept. but a D tier. A D tier because the spiral path itself is, the writing isn't that good. And it isn't really expanded upon the spiral path itself. Now the truth, definitely an A tier. It's such a nice twist for the 001 proposal slot that SCP-001 itself isn't even classified as SCP-001, but classified as some other anomaly, which you most likely know which anomaly the true SCP-001 is in this proposal. And it basically explains that the anomaly in question just expands the universe and kind of corrupts everything in its path the farther you go from essentially the observable universe. And with many weird creations being summed by that 001. And yeah, definitely an 8. It's a very cool story, a very cool concept, executed fairly well, and the twist is, it's a very nice change. A very nice change. As Andrew Swan's proposal of the database, it's my favorite SCP-001 proposal. I simply love meta stuff. And the last sentence of the note in that proposal is very chilling and very memorable. And definitely just shocked me out of my socks when I read it, when I initially read it so many years ago. Definitely a good one. And the amount of meta stuff, metaphysical SCPs that have spawned out of SCP-001, the database, are very, very interesting, and some are even better than this proposal. Now, a good boy, SCP-001. Also an S tier. Just the story behind it, how the Foundation creates an AI to deal with the anomalies, but the anomaly just taking over the O5 Council essentially and just neutralizing SCPs as the best way of containment and succeeding at that through not anomalous means but simple mathematics and very dull and weird, absurd containment procedures to subsequently kill the anomalies is such an interesting concept. The execution is fairly well, and then the story ends with 001 having destroyed every anomaly and shutting itself down, the SCP Foundation being disbanded, and the implication that we are living in this universe after the events, after 001 just killed every anomaly is so interesting and very, very chilling. Definitely gets points for that. Now we have 001 Tufto's proposal, the Scarlet King. It's an A tier. It's the Scarlet King, but in a very different way than many people would have expected. Instead of it being an actual tangible entity, it's actually a concept. A concept created through the conflict between the law of concrete and the law of blood, creating the law of howling. And it is in the law of howling that the Scarlet King manifests. Definitely a very interesting story. And putting a twist on the Scarlet King, instead of it being an entity, it being a concept. The Broken God. I like the twist that the Church of the Broken God were simply frustrated and not being able to find the true heart of the Broken God, their deity. It just created a fake heart, essentially, which is SCP-882, a machine. And then the twist at the end that SCP-882 was created by the Factory. And if you know the Factory, they're up to very shady stuff, and when they're involved, death is most likely going to be around the corner. 8 tier. The Living Room. Nice concept, executed fairly well. The only thing that I don't like about SCP-002 is that General Moldenhauser, the general that discovered SCP-002 in that story, just ordered a termination order because of eyewitnesses. Essentially, he ordered his soldiers, his agents, to kill everybody in the village because they saw SCP-002, which is very odd because amnestics exist, but at the same time, SCP-002 was written very, very early, and at that time, the concept of amnestics was most likely not even implemented yet in the SCP wiki. Now, SCP-003, the biological motherboard. I would say it's a B tier. I would give it an A tier if it was somehow related to Sarkicism, the Sarkic codes, but it doesn't really tie into that. But there's no canon, so my headcanon is that the lady that spawned out of SCP-003 was some representative of Yaldabaoth, the god that the Sarkics, the goddess that the Sarkics worship. That definitely makes for an interesting story, but it doesn't end with that. But at the same time, the Sarkicism, the Sarkic codes were most likely not implemented yet into the SCP community during the time that SCP-003 was released. So, can't really judge it, because it misses that. Well, so, SCP-004, the 12 keys and the door. It's a very interesting concept. A door which is opened by 12 different keys, and those lead to very hostile different dimensions related to the key that you open the door with. It's very interesting. I like the very interesting formatting of the SCP, because it's kind of messy, but at the same time, it kind of feels natural that the SCP Foundation would structure it like that. But I can see why people don't really like the formatting of this SCP. It's very, very messy. Kind of all over the place. But I like the execution and the concept. SCP-005, the skeleton key. It's a D tier. It's a key that essentially opens every single door by, I don't know, simply existing or something. Like, it could be a little bit more explored how it actually achieves opening every door. Does it shapeshift? Does it exert some form of radiation or something? It just says it can open any door by I don't know, by inserting the key into the lock. Well, very memorable SCP, very, very, very basic SCP. I would just wish that its backstory would be more expanded upon. It's one of those SCP items that everybody knows, because it was one of your most earliest written SCPs. The zombie plague. Can't go wrong with a good old zombie virus. A zombie plague is something different than a virus, but you get what I mean. I will always liked zombies. And having that in the SCP Foundation as SCP-008, I like it. And one of the better Series 1 SCPs. Though it does lack some incident log or something that ties to a bigger story, because it in the file just exists without any mentioning of an incident with it, like a site-wide containment breach and the 008 infected some personnel or stuff. That would be the cherry on top of the cake, but oh well. Red Eyes, one of the better Series 1 SCPs. It doesn't go into S tier, but for what it is, a B tier. I love the exploration log and what the actual anomaly is. Essentially ice from another dimension. It functions like our ice, just in reverse. When it gets hot or warm, it freezes, and when it gets cold, it melts, it becomes water, it becomes gas, and all that stuff. The reverse version of our ice. Now, SCP-011. It's interesting. I can't quite believe that the SCP Foundation just lets this SCP free into the wild, have his very comfortable life with his wife and stuff. They just nullified the entire containment procedures on SCP-011, which I can hardly believe. After some time, they just let it free, and that's pretty weird. But at least 011 is having the best time of his life. Oh, so that's nice. 012. I like the concept, but the execution is just so awkward. You can definitely tell that it's a product of its time. And I would really love to see a rewrite for this very well-known SCP. 014, The Concrete Man. Very interesting concept. It lacks a little bit in execution. It's a very early SCP. It's a man that believes that he is slowly turning into concrete and therefore becomes immortal. And one SCP Foundation doctor simply says that because he's thinking it, he becomes it, like, I think, therefore I am sort of deal, which is definitely very interesting. But it lacks an execution, like, is he actually made out of concrete? Is he actually turning into concrete? Why doesn't the Foundation take samples or medical checkups on 014 to test if he is actually becoming concrete? It's very open. That part of the story is left very open. But for what it is C tier. One of my favorite ones. Pipe Nightmare. Good concept, short and sweet, great execution. And then the tale, I think it was Plumbing, accompanying this SCP written by the same author of 015. It definitely sells this SCP. I move it to 8 here. It's just that good. 016. It's a virus which turns it's a virus which turns its hosts into mini 682s, essentially just adapting to the environment, external stimuli, internal stimuli, and all that stuff. But it can also kill its hosts when they expel too much blood, and that's its main method of spreading. It's bloodborne. It's a bloodborne virus. It's such a cool... I always love things that adapt to their situation and morph or transform. That's why I love 016. The Shadow Person. I don't really care for it, so an E tier. Definitely not bad, but I don't care. 022, The Morgue. I'm content to put it into A tier. Into S tier, yeah. Into S tier it goes. It's the interview log. The interview log itself just saves this entire SCP, and not that the rest is very bad. Just the interview log solos the interview log itself just deserves to be put in S tier. But the rest of his SCP also deserves to be put into S tier. It's simply such a good story and well written. S tier. Game Show of Death. It's a great concept. The execution is semi-good. I still don't know if people are getting transported into another dimension by this SCP, or if SCP-024 somehow transforms its interior dimensions or rearranges obstacles or something. This should be a little more expanded upon, but for what it is and for its time, it's definitely very good, a B tier. And still holds up to this day in some areas. 028, Knowledge. One of the better Series 1 SCPs. I don't particularly care for it, but one of the better ones. Definitely one of the better ones. 033. That's just a great concept and a great execution put very well together. Like one of the top ranked Series 1 SCPs, one of those Series 1 gems. 035, The Possessive Mask. I don't know about this one. I say that it's a C tier. I like how 035 is just kind of adapting to its environment, continuously breaking out and giving the Foundation a very bad time. I like that aspect of 035, and I always loved psychotic and sociopathic crazy villains, and 035 is exactly that. For that, it moves a tier higher. 048. It's an A tier. SCP-048, the cursed SCP number, it's like many of the SCPs here in tier A. It's a great concept with a great execution. the actual origin of SCP-048 out of universe was because many SCP authors just wrote an SCP and gave it the SCP-048 slot, but they were very bad and continuously getting deleted, and then the author of the current SCP-048 just decided to make the SCP-048 slot the actual anomaly, and that's why SCP-048 is considered the cursed SCP number, and that's why the former SCP-048 articles were deleted because of the current version of SCP-048, because this is the cursed SCP number. Very, very, very funny and very good. SCP-049, Plague Doctor S tier. If we were talking about the pre-rewrite 049, it would be somewhere around D to C tier, but the rewrite just gives this SCP so much more character rather than just it being a mindless killer zombie who turns things into mindless killer zombies. The rewrite definitely gave 049 much more of a character, and you can kind of sympathize with him, but at the same time not really, because he may have good intentions, but the methods that he's using are not very ethical. Well, let's put it at that. 053, the young girl. I don't know, I never understood why this SCP was so popular. I don't really care for the concept of this SCP, and the execution is very lacking. It just tells us what it is, and that's essentially it. With no origins and no bigger hints at a bigger story. Well, I like the implications that she's one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and one of the children of the Scarlet King, alone set 682. But still, for what it is and what is in the file, not that much. Then we have SCP-055. Unknown. It's an S tier, one of the better ones. And the first ever anti-memetic SCP. It's such a great concept, such great execution. I can't really say anything more about it. Though it is pretty weird how the Foundation can just write a file, an entire file on 055 with its anti-memetic properties, but oh well. It's kind of humorous at the same time, because the implication that they are discovering the SCP-055 file every day or every hour again and again, because they constantly forget that it exists and then rediscover it and then go on to panic before forgetting that 055 exists again. It's a funny thought. It's a funny thought. The Heart of Darkness. It's just another killer monster SCP. Well, I like its imagery. It definitely gets points for its imagery and for the level of destruction that it once caused. It's very, very destructive and it cannot be put down. It seems like a counter to 076-02 Able, but more animalistic and less rational. I always believe that SCP-058 is either one of the children of a Scarlet King born from SCP-231, as it is hinted at in 058's file, or one of the Scarlet King's servants, which definitely gives this SCP more of a substance. For what it is, it's yet another murder monster. 066, Eric's toy. It's definitely pretty funny and very weird and absurd, and sometimes weird and absurd SCPs are a nice change from all the various murder monster SCPs like 058. And it hints at a bigger story with Eric and it being the catalyst for the rest of the SCPs related to the POI Eric. Definitely gets points for that. It's a D tier though. 076 Kane. I don't really care for it all that much, and the whole reflects damage upon its opponent back again could be explored a little more, because how does he do it exactly? Or is it just reality bending, or how does he actually do it? It just says in the SCP file that he can do that, and that's it. For scientific foundation, organization, containment specialists, I expect more of a scientific explanation than just, oh, he can do that, and we don't really know how it happens, but, well, oh well, that's his quirk or something. But the amount of stories related to 073, and definitely give it points. 076 Abo. He's boosted up because of the whole empty of Omega-7 thing, and he being a big part of the Resurrection canon. Definitely gets an A tier. 076, my second favorite SCP, and not because of its file, but I always enjoyed sentient AIs which want to take over their creators, kill their creators, or something like that. It's just menacing. It's so uncaring. It's just an AI which has its own goals and you don't even know what its goals are. It's an A tier. It's definitely an A tier. And the videos from TED Stop Videos gave this SCP a lot of character, which the original SCP file, which is very, very bad for today's standards, didn't really give a 079. And I like that. I like how 079 and 682 are essentially best friends and buddies. It's a nice thought. Now, SCP-082, Fernand the Cannibal. It's very interesting, but not too interesting. Some human who mutated but is somehow still considered a human and very twisted. My belief is that 082 is from another dimension. It's as easy as that. F tier. Well, very funny. Very, very funny. It gets a few points because of its humor, but it's a very early SCP. The actual SCP file on SCP-082 ends with a pun which doesn't really make sense from a clinical perspective, but oh well. When we have SCP-085, Hand-drawn Cassie. It's very interesting. I like how it is the end product of an SCP experiment between SCP-067 and SCP-914. The Artisan's Pen and the Clockworks. It definitely gets points for that. But I don't really care for it all that much. SCP-086, the Office of Dr. Redacted. It's basically some former Foundation agent, I believe, who turned into his own office and now haunts various objects within. It's definitely pretty funny and a very interesting thought, very interesting SCP. It's so weird that it's good. It's so weird that it's good. SCP-087, the Stairwell. The exploration log saved this SCP because if it weren't for the exploration logs, I wouldn't really care for 087 that much. It's a C tier. One of the more scarier SCP as well, but at the same time, just don't go into 087. I don't understand people who actually think that 087 is scary, like in the regard of you encounter it. You can obviously distinct 087 from any normal stairwell or stairs by the complete darkness. It doesn't even attract people to it through mimetic effects. It's just, if you go in there, you're most likely doomed. But so you don't go in there. You just go out of the room and close the door behind you and pretend that nothing had happened. It's not going to come out and chase after you have left. So it's a C tier. The next is 089. It's very, very interesting. The twist that in order for it to be contained, a mother has to sacrifice their very own newborn child, which is just so horrific and gruesome, and the entire article alludes to that this protocol must be carried out at all times, and then at the end, it is revealed that what the actual protocol actually is, and the protocol is a mother has to sacrifice their newborn child. It's hinted at the beginning, and then the big reveal at the end just struck me very, very, very hard in the feels. A very cold protocol, but the Foundation has to carry it out, or else 089 will not create a catastrophe, but will bring forth a catastrophe, but it doesn't create the catastrophe. It's very interesting. And if you carry out the protocol, the catastrophe will be milded or completely halted. So that's cool. Seeing future-related SCP, which I always like. 093, the Red Sea object. The entire storyline of SCP-093 is just very impressive for Series 1 standards, and to this day, very impressive for today's standards. The entire story and those hints sprinkled throughout the entire file of SCP-098, the exploration logs, the recovered documents log, just tie everything together so perfectly that it deserves an S tier. The Shy Guy. Now, what really stuck into my mind with SCP-096 was the whole incident log, incident 096-alpha. This is like the main focus of SCP-096, and every time when I think about 096, I just think about the entire plot of Dr. Dan and the incident. And it's a well-written incident, a very well-written story, and deserves A tier. Why am I not putting it into S tier? There's no mention of cognitohazard related within SCP-096 as well, which it should at least contain the word cognitohazard in it, because SCP-096 is most definitely a cognitohazard when you look at its face. But oh well. Okay, I'm going to end this video soon. SCP-1000 Bigfoot. It's an S tier. The entire story, then the twist, and the many stories related to SCP-1000 which came after its original release. Just beautiful. One of the best pieces of SCP lore within the SCP lore. SCP-1004, Factory Porn, it's one of those joke SCPs. I like how it's tied to the factory, and it subsequently results in death when you quote-unquote use it, if you know what I mean. It's a B tier. It's a good one. It's a good humor SCP. SCP-1006. Communist spiders living somewhere in the woods. I usually don't really like SCPs which are essentially just animals which can speak or are intelligent. But this SCP is not only one instance of a sentient, talkative animal, but a lot of them. An entire community, an entire civilization, and out of all civilizations, it has to be a goddamn communist one. Of course, communist spiders. It's so beautiful. It's a C tier. A very, very interesting one. SCP-1024. You might recognize this SCP from the game SCP Containment Breach, but a lot of people misinterpret this SCP because it doesn't actually give you any of the diseases. It just makes people around you think that you have a disease. Like if I were to open SCP-1025 and read a page about cancer, I don't actually get cancer. Those people around me those people around me think that I have cancer and want to treat me as such and all that related stuff. They genuinely think that I have been infected with cancer and all that stuff, while I'm psychologically and physically healthy. And it's definitely a nice twist at the end of the article. It isn't really stated, it's only subtly hinted at. And that's that's always more appreciated than just slapping it into your face. SCP-1032. I always like time-related SCPs. I always like those SCPs. It's a clock that predicts things which will occur in the future by one of its little, I don't know, fingers reaching the 12 mark. And once it hits the 12 mark, that event is going to occur. It doesn't create that event, it just predicts that event. Fitting nickname, because its nickname is the prediction clock. It's an S tier for me. So the last 3 SCPs, Build-A-Bear. At first you think that it's a little cute teddy bear which doesn't want to do any harm, like another version of SCP-999, but then the twist comes and then ear bears, weird baby bears, and mecha bears just start rampaging around the world and kill people and all that stuff. And the best part is that SCP-1048 itself is not even contained, it just escaped and it's loose and about and could be creating an entire army of murderous teddy bears right now. It's so beautiful. An S tier. One of the most memorable SCPs for me, because I at first thought it was just a nice teddy bear, and then it started creating killer bears and it was very disturbing. SCP-1050. It's the amount of research done for this SCP is just very, very, very impressive. But the anomaly itself is essentially just an intergalactic warning system for extinction events. And on the obelisk itself, many extinction events are inscribed upon, like the end of the dinosaurs and all that beautiful stuff. Many other extinction events. Real-life extinction events, I might add, which explains the lot of research done for this SCP part. The SCP Foundation, SCP-1050 emits some radio waves which act like warning systems for other SCP-1050s on other planets which do exist. It's an intergalactic warning system, as previously stated. And the SCP Foundation just stopped their SCP-1050 from emitting any radio waves or warning signals, so that other planets may be targeted first by what is called by SCP-1050 as the destroyers, which just destroy worlds and go on and about. And they blocked their 1050 from emitting any signals, so that the other planets get targeted first and giving Earth another day to live while other planets are just going to die. The good old O5 comes to the good old SCP Foundation. For the greater good, I guess. It's very cruel by the Foundation, very cold. But they only care about humanity. That's how it is. SCP-1055, Bugsy. It's interesting. I don't really care about it. It's very humorous how, when you know about that bear is just growing to grow and grow and grow and become more powerful and powerful. It's definitely interesting, but and very humorous and nice humorous thought, but I don't care for it. I simply don't care for it. So the last SCP, SCP-1057, Absence of a Shark. It's essentially just an invisible, intangible shark. It isn't more than that. But I like its ties to Are We Cool Yet, the group of interest. It's a E tier. It's essentially just an invisible shark. Without the Are We Cool Yet tie-in that SCP-1057 has, it would definitely be an F tier, but it saves itself because Are We Cool Yet is pretty cool. So, this is going to be the first part of my SCP tier list. As you can see, there are many, many more SCPs that I haven't ranked yet, which I will cover in the future videos. I hope you enjoyed and have a nice day wherever you are. Bye.